Okay, this board talk is being recorded, just so everyone knows. Tēnā te mihi nui, kia koutou, no mai haere mai. Welcome to Board Talks. My name is Rose. I'm the CEO of Community Governance Aotearoa, and I'm pleased to present our Board Talk series. Today we have a much needed talk for you, which is Charities Act changes, all the things that we need to know and what it all means. So there is quite a bit to get through. Board Talks is designed to get the best advice, topics that you need to help your organisations thrive. We've had a big response to today's talk, so we've had over 680 people register for today, so that's fantastic. But we've also going to have to wade through all the kind of technical information out there, so we've got an expert panel guest with us today, super excited. Because this is a Zoom talk, we're going to ask you if you've got any questions, please use the chat function. So you can pop it in and ask us, and throughout the call, I'll do my best to get the questions to our panel guests. Due to the high number of registrations today, but we do think there's going to be lots of questions. So also you can put it in, you can send us an email at info@communitygovernance.org.nz, and post this talk, we will be releasing the video, so you can play it. It's also got a Spotify audio version as well if you just want to listen in, and we'll do a little bit of FAQs to wrap up this talk for you, along with lots of helpful links and talks, which I'm sure everyone's going to want to share today as well. Okay, before we kick off, I just want to say a big shout out to our key sponsor, which is Cat Herder. They've got some awesome resources, so please check them out. So thanks, awesome team. We appreciate our sponsor because we send a lovely gift pack out to our panelists as well. So thanks. Okay, so now we have guests with us today. We have Andrew Newbery, some of you might know him from Charities Services, Michelle Kitney from Volunteering New Zealand, and Steven Moe from Parry Field Lawyers. Welcome to our panelists. Right, so what we do at Board Talks is we don't spend too long on your amazing backgrounds and your amazing kind of career and that kind of thing. We put your profiles up in the chat so people can check you out on LinkedIn or check your organisations out. But I'm going to ask you, just to get to know you a little bit better, we have over 28,000 charities in New Zealand. That's the stats that Charities Services have given us, so we're reliant on them. But so I'm going to ask each of you, who is, bearing in mind we have thousands of charities, who's your favourite charity? And you're going to have to pick one, even though I'm sure you're not going to want to. So who'd like to go first? Who's going to share with us who's your favourite charity? Okay, I'll pick someone. Michelle?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Michelle Kitney aho. I'm the Chief Executive of Volunteering New Zealand, so it's a privilege to lead that organisation. We're a charity, so that would have to be one of my favourite charities because I spend a lot of time working in that space, obviously. But I'm also a trustee of Ballyful New Zealand, so I have to give a big ups to them as a charity. And that's a really tough question because there's so many other amazing ones that I'd love to reel off, but I'll stop. Kia ora.
Very good. Of course, you have to say your own one too, Michelle, don't you? So well done. Steven, have you got a favourite charity?
It's such a hard question, right? I think in the last year, our team has helped set up about 50 different charities, so it's hard to choose one. If I'm going to, I know that Etu Tangata is a really cool charity, which is looking at tackling tall puppy syndrome, and in particular, looking at helping our youth. We have a suicide epidemic in New Zealand, so that's what they're focused on. And I love their kaupapa, their purpose, and what they're doing.
No, it's very nice. Thank you, Steven. Over to you, Andrew.
Kia ora koutou, Andrew Newbery. I am the Manager Engagement and Business Improvement at Charities Services. As Rose points out, there's over 28,000 charities in New Zealand. So when we counted last year, it was about 28,800. So far too many for me to really single any one charity out. I would note that we are invited here today by a registered charity, so just a big shout out to Community Governance Aotearoa for the great work that they're doing.
Thank you. And I think you won the answer there then, Andrew. You get an extra special kind of gift sent out to you. Thank you. You are a little bit muffled. I think you might sound like you're a little bit underwater there, Andrew. So hopefully you might. We're going to want to hear some of your things that you can share with us too. So hopefully the audio might get a bit better. Okay. So Board Talks is designed for our community, by our community. It's a series that kind of created to bring our community together so that we can get the best of the best. So we get the best panelists, we get the best experts, but it's really led by what our community of not-for-profits, for-purpose, NGO community need. With that in mind, we've had thousands of people register for Board Talks over the last couple of years, and we've got a really strong, really cool audience that's been with us. We've also had some really great topics as well, from policies right through the whole kind of gambit at the moment. And this talk is obviously well needed because of the Charities Act and changes. So with such a high registration number, obviously this is a topic that we all kind of really want to know a bit more about. So again, with the Zoom call, we're asking if you can put your questions into the chat function. Because there's so many on the call, that's the best way to do it, rather than coming off mute and asking questions. So if you can do that, and one of us or the team will answer it as well. So let's get into today's topic, which is Charities Act changes and what this means for us. Let's explore, why was the Charities Act updated? So why is this updated? I'm looking at you, Andrew, if you can't tell. And what does this kind of mean for us? So let's explore what were the kind of changes. Why was the Act needed to be updated?
Cool. Yeah, I mean, great question. And I'm sure that Steve and Michelle will have some really good comments on this as well. But I guess from a kind of government point of view, there was some desire from the government to modernise, I guess, the Act that we had in play and address some of the issues that charities had been communicating back to us and to ministers about, stuff that they were struggling with. So there was a real focus on improving access to justice, so appeals and objections for charities, reducing red tape for smaller charities, and improving kind of transparency so that people have a lot more clarity around what the regulator's doing, what Charity Services and the board, what people's respective roles are.
Okay, so that sounds like some big changes that needed to happen. Steven, what's your kind of perspective on this?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to remember that society itself changes over time, and it's important that legislation doesn't get stuck at one point. So it's actually important that it evolves and grows. And this act that we're talking about is the Charities Act 2005. So I don't know about all of you. I got married in 2005. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but actually it's 19 years. Isn't that strange how time goes by? 19 years ago is when this act was passed. So actually it probably needed a bit of an update and a refresh. One conceptual point is that this was not a wholesale reinvention of the Charities Act. This was what I would call some tweaking and some updating rather than a first principles review. So that's something people get confused about. It's not like we have a brand new act. We have an amendment act, and there's some key things which have changed, which we're going to talk about, but just good to get that clear. And don't forget, there's other acts as well. There's the Charitable Trusts Act, which is even older, 1957. Some of you might be incorporated societies. That act was 1908 and has just been updated. So yeah, that's the scheme of history that we're in.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. That's I think we'll get into that a little bit too, because we've had a few questions come in around from incorporated and the differences. So, so bearing in mind, we've got lots of questions that we will probably hear from our community. But so the Charities Act has changed, and like Steven's saying and Andrew, there's been some amendments. So everyone's now thinking, what do we have to do and what do we have to get done? But how do we see the changes to the Act? So the guidelines and some rules around it for how we govern and our responsibilities. But how do you see this Act actually helping our charities govern and operate at a real high level? How do we see any legal changes that are happening within the Act? How is it going to benefit in the scheme of where we're going and the responsibility? So, Michelle, would you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I guess sort of just building on what Steven was just saying and thinking back to well, there's two things. Obviously it wasn't a first principles review and there's still interest from across the sector for potentially looking at that, but that would be a huge piece of work that would have to actually go back and look at you know, who are we as a society right now? And that's a really big question. And the interconnection with other pieces of legislation, as Steven mentioned, is really important to be aware of too, because actually if you did that first principles review, it'd have a massive legislative knock-on effect. In terms of the impact for organisations, this is sort of, I guess, a side observation. Thinking about history, Steven, one of my first jobs, I was an assistant registrar for incorporated societies. And I remember looking at the files held by Ministry of Economic Development right back then. And on the records, there weren't information that you needed to be able to deal with a complaint or records about officers or information, up-to-date information. So a lot of the changes are going to make it easier for, I guess, managing it for everybody, access to information, things like that. But I think it's obviously making things easier for smaller organisations. And I think a key thing looking at the tier change and increasing the tier 4 from 100,000 to 140,000 is a really great kind of thing that sits alongside this, which means there's a greater number of small organisations that fit into tier 4. So that's something that I think is really beneficial to the sector.
Yeah, those are some great points, Michelle. So it is around obligations and increasing who's in the space. So and how we govern together, especially with our management teams. And we often do dual roles especially in our tier 4 and tier 3. So for those of us who aren't quite sure about the tiers when we're talking about it, we've got a link that we'll put in the chat so you can access and we can share it out. But that does respond and correlate to your obligations. Yeah, so I think that would be helpful because it does kind of set out what your obligations are and then what does it mean in essence for how you govern your charity. So very helpful if you don't know much about the tiers. This is a really good guide in there, and Steven's shared some other links in there as well. One thing that was really important for me about this talk is to get to some myth busting. So what I hear, and I get lots of kind of questions coming in from, and been quite some time, that's why I thought it's really timely for us to get to talk about the Charities Act changes. So I thought we'd do a little bit of, let's demystify the myths, some of the things that I've been hearing from our community. So these are some of the generalisation things hearing. Do we need an auditor for our accounts? This is from a very small charity. Do we need a lawyer to update our constitution and deed in our governance policies in the new Act changes? Do we need to create a conflict of interest register and why? What I like to do is, can we do a bit of myth busting, some of these things that we're hearing? So the first one that we got is, do we need an auditor for our accounts? Now, I had a phone call from a person from a very small charity just last week, actually, who rang and said, Rose, she's very lovely, do I need an auditor for our charity? I was like, well, what kind of income have you got? Like, what are you kind of managing in your finances and your accounts? And she said that they have about $4,000 on their books. So I said, no, you do not need an auditor because it probably cost you that and more just to get one. So this is a question out to our panelists. Do we need an audit for our accounts? And the tiers will come into that. Do we need a lawyer to update our constitution and our deeds? Because you don't always need that. And do you need to create a conflict of interest? So maybe each of you could pick up one of those. So do we need an auditor for our accounts? What do you think, Andrew?
I was just going to say I'm really happy to jump in on the audit one. So yeah, like I think Rose, you said to the small charity, for a charity that size, you really don't need to be looking at auditors. You know, we're talking about charities which are under $140,000 a year. You know, they're not going to need that level of scrutiny. There are specific audit and review requirements, but we're talking about charities that have, you know, more than $550,000 a year. So this is a pretty big step up. So if you're under that, I really don't think that that's something you should be pushing yourself into. That said, some charities will have an audit requirement built into their rules. So if that is something that your rules stipulate, but it's no longer really working for you, then we'd really encourage you to have a look at that and maybe see if you can amend those rules to remove that requirement, because if it's not adding value for your organization, then it doesn't need to be there.
Actually, that's a really good point, because I've actually had that question. In the deed, it says we need to have an audit done. Yeah, so no, we don't. We actually got a question in our chat, so I'll just keep us on this. From Ashley. So when they say operating expenses, so this is still with you, Andrew, does that mean total revenue? We got a large donation this year, but have spent less than 140K. Are we tier 3 or 4? Put you on the spot. What do you think?
So, and this is where I wish I was an accountant, but which I'm not.
Okay.
But when we're talking about operating expenses, that is the money that your charity is spending. You know, when we're talking about even tier 3, we're talking about under 2 million. So the thresholds there are quite significant, quite a large, wide range. But yeah, if you're expending under $140,000, you're tier 4. That's the broad strokes.
Yeah, and I have to say, good on you, Ashley. What a great donation. So well done. Okay, so let's go back to, Sam, we've got a lawyer here, so that's quite handy. We've got Steven who can answer this one. Do we need a lawyer, Steven, to update our constitution, our deeds, and our governance policies? When do we need one, and when can we just kind of do it ourselves? What do you think?
It's a great question, and maybe Michelle can comment as well, as someone who's not a lawyer, because I'm kind of obviously prejudiced in a certain way. But I'll just give a little story. Unfortunately, I got a kidney stone about 4 weeks ago. It was incredibly painful. Did I go to Google to find out what to do, or did I go to the A&E to talk to a doctor who could help me? I went to the A&E. If any of you have had this, you know what I'm talking about. So I guess you go to a specialist who can help you if it's needed. Obviously, there may be some cost implications, but of course, my advice would be, if you can afford it, then getting a specialist to help you is probably going to be better than getting a generic template and starting to fill things in. I actually have seen people fill things in. They went to Google, downloaded what they thought was the right document. Actually, it talked about the New South Wales Commissioner of Charities, and they downloaded something that was totally inappropriate. So getting the right source is a really important step. And Rose, I remember when we had conversations going back about setting up community governance Aotearoa, you know, we were talking about what you should do. And so you saw value in it as well in terms of getting legal input. But maybe, I don't know, Michelle, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I think it's definitely you want to use a lawyer where you need to. And I think there's a few factors that you'd want to take into consideration, depending on what it is you're looking at and whether you have the skills and experience on your board or team to do it. But I think it's a hygiene factor in terms of time and I guess skills available. And definitely there are times where getting a lawyer to do some of the more technical stuff that nobody has the skills or the time to work through is really useful. I think our experience recently is that we've been looking at our own constitution under the Incorporated Societies Act. So I think there's always going to be a bit of pre-work that boards and management need to do together to figure out what changes they need to do or want to do. And I think particularly thinking about re-registering as an incorporated society. I know this is about the Charities Act, but actually there's some fundamental questions about that, including, is actually an incorporated society still the right entity structure to have? So it's probably good to have, your strategic kind of questions all sorted out before you go to a lawyer, and make sure you're asking and spending the money on what you need to get done. I say that knowing that for a lot of smaller organisations that have very limited resources, that it may be challenging to find the pūtea to do that. But I just wanted to also acknowledge that there's some really great guidance out there to support governors and management of organisations to really find their way through this. Parry Fields have got lots and lots of stuff on the Incorporated Societies Act. Charities Services has lots of information, and there's lots of really awesome free stuff out there to help guide you before you go to a lawyer.
Yeah, and I think that's really good advice. Although I have to say, I think there is a bit of a difference here on setting up a new charity, which that's what we were doing as community governance. To my question is updating constitution. So yeah, there are some resources, like I think at Charities Services, Andrew, I think you can, there's some guidelines on that, so you don't technically need to have a lawyer for all those reviews, which is what you're saying too, Stephen, around if you want to take out that requirement to need to have an auditor, that's where you can do it without actually costing you the need of a lawyer. So for updating those constitutions and deeds, our constitution and our deeds is the most critical part really to govern, give us some guidance, and so super important.
May I add something? I think when you are updating those documents, so your constitution under the Incorporated Societies Act, it's good to be mindful of the fact that you also still need to not mess with your charitable purpose in such a way that it affects your charity registration. So you do need to be thinking about things globally. Oh, have I frozen? Should have frozen.
You did. Still looking good though, Michelle. Still good. So then the third one on this myth busting is because these are some of the common questions that I get. So is around, do we need to create a conflict of interest register? Now this is directly going back to the changes of the Act. So anyone want to share some insights on that?
Yeah,
I know the answer, but
I think it's something I can cover off. I think this is absolutely, when we talk about good governance and the kinds of things that can help keep people safe when they're running a charity, something like a conflict of interest register or policy is super important. It just means that you're keeping yourself protected, just like on the off chance that something does. It's not about sort of self-recrimination. It's about putting stuff in place so that you are really safe and that you've got ways forward if something happens. One thing that we will be have introduced in our new forms is when you register, we'll be asking you a question just saying, have you got something in place to manage potential conflicts of interest if they should arise? So that is part of the work that our registration team will do when they meet up with new charities.
I think what you said there, Andrew, needs a bit of deciphering a little bit. It was a bit muffled. Sorry. It's a little bit.
The short answer is yes, it's a good idea to have a conflict of interest policy and register. And it's something that our team will ask you about when you register.
Yeah. And I think we need we have a template or a resource in there for that because, look, it's already efficiently put it in there.
I
did you
can
want
actually
to comment, Steven?
Yeah, I can continue that just to reinforce what Andrew's saying and to say this is a great example where you don't need to go to a lawyer because Charities Services have a page which is really excellent on conflicts of interest. I get this question all of the time and I send people there. And when I'm helping set up a new charity, I actually use the wording from Charities Services as a one-page template conflict of interest policy. But I actually think this is really important because guess what's going to be the front page of the local newspaper if you don't get this right? Like this is the stuff that causes the disrepute to come into play. So if you're an officer of an incorporated society or a charitable trust or whatever it is, and you also own a catering company, you need to declare that your catering company has been selected by the charity to provide the food at the next event and is being paid, and you shouldn't be there when that decision is made. So it sounds basic when I say that, but you'd be surprised how often these conflicts actually don't get disclosed. And it might not be financial, it could be relationship. So we're going to hire a new person to help run the charity. You know that it's your niece or nephew. You should declare that. If in doubt, just tell people disclosure is the sanitizer for conflicts.
Yeah, and I think that's the going back to the intention of why these changes have been, amendments have been made, is around just more keeping things, front of mind and how we are managing and responsible for the work that we're doing, which is community relationship based. So yeah, conflict of interest, this is not to check in and micromanage you. This is around you taking ownership of your own charity and saying, are there any contracts that we have that does it relate to someone? Is it a friend of a friend? Like just put them down. It is not hard to create a conflict of interest register, and it is also equally not hard to check in on that kind of policy once a year. If you need some help, just reach out to us or the team. Happy to send you in the right direction. Okay, so it does lead into.
Can I add one thing, Rose? I was just going to say Board Pro, if you use Board Pro, it has a really great conflict of interest process. You register at there and then it presents it for each board meeting, and then you can make sure it's up to date and current and, reflect on that conflict of interest ahead of discussion in the agenda. So
yeah, I think a lot of us who sitting in that tier 4-3, Board Pro is a little bit out of scope, but it's very simple with the conflict of interest register. And we've, in community governance, also have been working on a bit of a policy pack that we'll be happy to share. I just want to move into charities and our tiers, because we've got quite a few questions coming in around what it means in operating. I can see a lot of comments coming in, but my question really is around thinking about our charities. Are there different rules for bigger charities and smaller? So this was purposely around the tier structure, but what acts really resonate or mean for the different tiers? Just if we've got some thoughts on that, and I'll just check through our comments coming in as well.
Well, can I kick that one off maybe? Is that okay? I mean, from my perspective, Andrew, feel free to jump in. I think we run into a danger here if we start saying some rules apply to some charities and not to others. It's true that when it comes to accounting and reporting, that there's different standards, but it's not like smaller charities don't have legal obligations and officers don't have legal duties. So I think it's really important that we emphasize that there are rules that apply to all of you. And this is important because we wouldn't want people to go away thinking, oh, we're just a small one. We don't have to worry about our duties or what it is that we need to do. And just so it's clear, in my mind, the Charities Act has implemented two really significant changes that I want everybody to know about. The first is that every 3 years, you need to review your rules. That's really, really important. I can't tell you how many times I have charities come to me and their rules are dated 1972 or 1945 or 2017. Anytime that you've got rules which have been there for a long time, it's probably good practice to revisit them and refresh them. So it ties in with what we were saying before. But as an example, for those of you who are trusts, there's a new act called the Trusts Act 2019, which applies to you. So your trust deed probably needs to be upgraded and updated to reflect the changes in legislation. The Charities Act in the future will require you to say every 3 years, our rules are fit for purpose. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is the definition of officers has changed. So officers now has an expanded definition. I think this is really critical for you all to think about, because what you thought about in the past, oh, they're the trustees or the officers. Now it's everyone who has substantial influence over decisions of the charity. So it's an expanded version of who is an officer. And that's important for you to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Stephen. It's kind of jumped ahead a bit on our kind of questions that we've got today, but that's where we get into around the changes of the Act, isn't it? Is that it's a simple one, is every 3 years you must review. And what does that review mean? Does it mean that you need to undertake a big change to your deed and requirements? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. So it is around just making sure that you've got some good governance practice and some things that you can do there. Community governance, we've actually got a board evaluation tool on our website now that you can use and download. That's for free, so that can help you with your governing practice and what you might need. But it is around I think the intention is to just make sure that we've got some good governing across our charities. And one of those changes, which is you've mentioned, Stephen, is around the obligations as an officer. So we'll probably move to that question, which is one of the key changes to the Act. So I was just thinking about what our panel thoughts are on that. When we have people that are making decisions within the charity, the accountability. So what does this mean? Is this saying, I'm going to pose it as a question for our panel. Does it mean that managers or those of influence need to be registered as an officer? What have we got some thoughts on that change, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, and sorry if my audio is a little bit iffy at the moment. I'm trying what I can as we go to fix it. But yeah, it will mean, I mean, I think the important thing here is that everyone who previously qualified as an officer will continue to qualify as an officer. You know, you're not going to be removing people. It's like Stephen said, it's expanding that definition. So we are looking at, you know, if you're CEO or your CFO, or you've got, you know, someone in a like high-level management role who's actually making kind of strategic decisions about what your organization is doing, then they probably would be captured.
I can continue that thought, because Andrew, I think some people are struggling to hear you. I think
I saw Rose comment as I was saying it. So.
Yeah, you might need I don't know if you've got a headset, Andrew. You could have you got any? We really want to hear what you got to say too. So I was trying to decipher it like everyone else, but
I think what he said was that the definition of officers is that it's not like the people who have been officers won't be officers in the future. What's happened is an expanded definition. So there might be people who didn't used to be officers and now they will be officers. So think, for example, if you had a trust, you had 6 trustees, they would naturally be officers because they make decisions. But what about the general manager of your trust? They probably now fit within the definition of an officer. So you'll have to add them in as one of the officers listed with Charities Services.
Yes, yeah, and actually that's what Bonnie's question is as well. As an officer, does that mean we'll be held accountable for decisions and consequences? Essentially, yes, this is what they're saying. So the Act's intention is to anyone in those kind of decision-making roles.
I would just add, Rose, that some of this changes, like some of these, the responsibilities that we're talking about already kind of fall onto the Chief Executive or Health and Safety at Work Act. You're an officer under that. And Stephen will know more about this from a legal perspective, but some of the changes that have come through in the Incorporated Societies Act and the Charities Act are a codification of responsibilities you already had in particular roles. But it will depend on your role and what your delegated responsibilities are, and also the type of entity that you are.
Yeah, and I think that is around how much you need to consider how much influence, and often in our space, and we are doing dual roles and very close into governing and operations, and there is this kind of grey area. So it's a really great space to say, oh.
Sorry, look,
you sound better. Yeah.
Does
okay.
it? Okay.
Yes, that's sounding a lot better. Good test.
Sorry, now I have
Andrew.
Rose, just to pick up on that, the other thing that I think is important, it's coming through in the chat, is that some people get confused about what they are, like incorporated societies, charitable trusts, and now we're talking about registered charities. We mentioned 28,000 are registered charities, but statistics show there's about 118,000 actual groups. So just because you're an entity or even an unincorporated society, it doesn't mean that you're a registered charity. And I'm sure some of those on the call are confused by this, but there's two stages here. The first one is that you set up an entity and you would be a charity. That doesn't mean that you're automatically a registered charity. You have to apply to Charities Services to join the 28,000, which then gets you access to the tax position of being a registered charity. So I think it's important just to bust that myth as well, that there is kind of two types of entity that we're talking about as well.
Yes, and actually we're probably moving into this kind of topic because I had quite a few queries about this exact scenario. So there, one of the questions I've got is, do any of these changes affect incorporated societies looking to become a charity? So that is what Steven is saying. Just because you're incorporated doesn't mean you're technically a charity. You have to register, go through the process so they know that you're purposeful and that you're there for charitable purposes. So it's a next step. You can be both. But the question that I've had that came in actually was around, if you're looking to become a charity, do any of these affect you as an incorporated society?
I recently spoke to a very small entity, an incorporated society, and I kind of looked at the incorporated society stuff and the charity stuff, and there's such a nice crossover. If you get as far as being an incorporated society, you're ticking off pretty much now under the new Act, which comes in, and once you register under the new Act, Incorporated Societies Act, you're basically doing everything you probably need to from a governance point of view anyway, to get charity registration or compliance, should I say.
Yeah, and I mean, if people are interested, of the 28,000, there's different types of legal entity, which are then charities, registered charities. So the last I heard, Andrew, I think it's about 8,000 to 9,000 are incorporated societies. So 28,000 total, and 8,000 or so are registered incorporated societies. But then you have charitable trusts. You also have charitable companies. So a talk like this, it's hard because we're giving lots of good information here, but it will depend on your context and your situation as to which rules apply to you.
Yeah, and I think that's the strong response that we've had is obviously just trying to get a sense of where to go for good information and how does it apply, because sometimes when you're wading through a lot of information that's out there, and there are some great resources in the charity services, a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly where you are. You can end up in a bit of a rabbit hole a little bit. So there's it's interesting, and we've got some of those templates that we can share around the tiers, because that's something that not all of our charities, not all community groups really understand. So that's why it's important to understand where you're sitting on there. And there was quite a lot of questions on that, but like I said, again, we can come back and help answer some of these and get some information about where you're going. Charities Services has lots of resources around the timing. That was something I was looking for, with a link on the stages and timing for this, because there's a bit of a process April just put the charities one in there. Yeah, and interestingly, out of our 28,000 tiers, I think there was about 23,000 who've registered through Charities Services. So looking at a tier 4, there's about 13,500 who are sitting in a tier 4 as a charitable organisation. So registered, that is a lot. So that's sitting under 140,000. So really, you know, kind of very small kind of groups here. So yeah, not a lot of resources, not a lot of money. And when we got money, we have to use it smartly. So this is why this talk is really needed, guiding our groups to where to get the best information. And then the tier 3, which is another really at that community level, is 8,000. So all up, a lot of really small organisations needing some good advice and guidance, which is why we're here today. We might not get to all your technical questions. There's quite a bit coming in, but we, like I said, we'll do our best. Okay, someone, Carolyn, yes. Do you have to have registered constitution to be incorporated? I think someone.
The short answer to that is yes, you do.
Yes,
it's a different. So
yeah.
there's, if you don't have a constitution, you can exist, but you're what's called an unincorporated society. So it's basically members, we come together, we meet, we do some amazing things, but we don't exist as a separate legal entity. You need rules or a constitution, and that then you incorporate and become a separate thing to the individuals involved, which is important because it reduces your liability. Unincorporated societies, which will be some of you on the call, ultimately the members are liable personally. So it's important to consider setting up an entity so that the liability sits at the entity, not at the members themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, actually. Just looking at Karen's comment. So she's saying slightly off topic, but it kind of actually just relates to what Steven is saying, is what level of trustee insurance do you recommend, and should we now include officers? So that's a really good question, Karen. What does everyone think?
I think that'll depend on the organisation. You have to go through your own risk assessment, and yeah, what events you might need to be insured for and things like that. I think most associations probably do have insurances though.
Yeah, I always just think it depends on the circumstance. Like Michelle says, if you're a small group, one of the others mentioned, what was the budget, $4,000? You probably can't afford it. Let's be honest, it's expensive to get insurance. And we all see that in our own. I got a letter the other day from the insurance company, and guess what? Premiums are going up across the board. Remember, there's a case that came out recently called Mainzeal, and Mainzeal, an ex-prime minister of New Zealand, was held liable for $6 million plus. And so that has put a bit of fear into the governance area, including a crossover into charities. So I think insurance companies are lifting their cost of their premium. But I would say, well, what do we actually do? Like, where is the liability going to come from? Are we taking people out on adventures and climbing cliffs and they might fall down and break their bones? Or are we gathering together as a group and talking and meeting? You know, like, where's the actual liability? Try to be practical about that.
Yeah, and what's your level of accountability? Like you're saying, if you know, how much are you managing? What are you managing? Assets, property, portfolios. What's the big risk? Because bringing anyone into those responsibilities, whether it's the officer who's making more informed decisions and working in the governance, does mean you should be responsible and protect your trustees as best you can. Okay, lots of different questions that we've had coming in. We're focused on officer obligations, which is one of the big key changes in the Act. We've done a bit of myth busting around audits and constitutions and deeds. We've got a couple of questions sitting in here. I thought that's a nice, Steve, I was going to say, Steven has just said, yeah, same for trustees, constitutions, societies, they're just words. Really,
yeah, I'm trying to pop things in the chat.
Yeah,
putting things in the chat as we go, and I put some links to things as well. If people are interested, there's some free things there.
Yes, and it is around just rules to guide your organisation. What's your intention? And that's the whole Act changes, isn't it, Andrew, around what's the intention? And the intention of that Act changes and amendments too is to make sure that we're just checking in. Are we up to date? Have we done these kind of check-in things? Have we got the right people governing? Have we got some conflict of interest registers underway? Do we know who are making really big decisions for our charities? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry everyone for the terrible audio so far. Yeah, I would just say with the governance review piece, that is really just about making sure that your group who's in charge of this charity and responsible for it is turning their mind to it regularly. You know, just having a think about, does this help us do the things we need to do? Does it help us fulfill our charitable purpose? And are we still kind of in the right place? Do we need to adjust anything?
It was still a bit murky. Sorry, Andrew.
Rose, in the chat, I'm just going to put a link to a PowerPoint presentation on the key changes to the Charities Act. So people can have a look at that as well as follow-up.
Yeah, and we've got some great links too from Charities Services that are in there as well, and it states just some of the key dates and timings as well. Got a question in here around, this might be one for you, Michelle. In a totally voluntary organisation, does the Community Assistance Club elected governance groups elected by the members, president, vice president, treasurer, represent the trustees? And if not, who would be?
If I understand the question correctly, are they, it sounds like there's an incorporated society, there's a member organisation, and it has executive members on the committee, and they would be officers, as I understand, if they are also a registered charity. But if not, they're probably officers under the Incorporated Societies Act.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the Incorporated Societies Act reinforces the changes that are going on here. So there is some consistency across legislation. So yeah, don't view it just as, oh, this act changed and this act changed. Kudos to government. They do have a broader view across what governance should be. And I just take heart that so many people are joining this call because we want to see better governance in our groups. So keep on the journey. Realize that once you've started learning about governance, it doesn't stop. You don't get to an endpoint and be like, oh, now I know everything there is. If anything, you realize that how much more you need to learn.
Yeah, and it's obviously why community governance Aotearoa is here, is to help you on that kind of journey, because things change all the time. We've been in cost of living crisis, we've had post-COVID, we've had climate change disaster, floods, cyclones. Like you can't always anticipate what's coming. So you do need to upskill yourself all the time. You do need to take ownership of your learning and make sure you're doing your best to get the skill set behind you in your governing roles and take it. And we take it very seriously. Just one of the links that is in there, and it is a really great checklist, which is by the Charities Services, which I really like. So really helpful governance checklist. I think everyone should try and check this out, but it has things like this. So rules and documents, is your charitable purpose still current? Does it reflect the work you do? And then you say, there's some questions, yes or no, really, again, really helpful. Have you got some processes in place for your organisation? Health and safety checklist. Are you keeping your people safe? Do you have a health and safety plan? Managing staff and volunteers. Are you keeping your staff volunteers safe? Do you have an induction plan? Now, record keeping, I'll just list off a couple more because we've got a little few minutes. Do you keep good records? Are you aware of privacy laws? Do you store information securely? These are just really great things that you need to think about in your rules and obligations and the work that you do when you put your hand up to serve on charitable organisations. So I would have a look at that PDF guide. It's really helpful. It's also got some links out to health and safety checklists, that kind of thing. So again, really, really kind of smart resource there.
And Rose, there's another one on your website, actually. It was compiled, 80 of us contributed to it. It's called the Charities Health Checks. So I just put it as a link there. It's a download from your website. And yeah, it's a whole series of questions for charities to look at. We cover assets, policies, people, governance, and there's specific targeted topics. And it's all for free. So there you go.
Yeah, that's kind of our mandate at Community Governance. We try and get as much resources and content out for free because, like I said, you just have a look at the numbers across our community organisations. It's a huge sector. We love what we do and we want to value it. And having great people like our panellists here today can kind of try and help us dissect some of this really sometimes complex information. So it can be really tricky when you're very kind of time poor and you're trying to search for things, where to go. So this is why this is really needed to help us say, look, this is where you go. This is the intention of the Act, is really high level, is around just making sure you're checking in. Are you doing your job? Are you governing well? Who is with you in making decisions? Yeah, so it's probably very timely and a huge amount of resources coming in. Is there anything that, just as we're kind of wrapping, that each of you would like to share? So with us about anything in particular that we might not have covered that you think you'd like to share with our audience?
I can share something, Rose, and sort of it builds on what we were just talking about, the awesome resources that you have, your principles of also an awesome tool. But once you've done the review you might need to do every 3 years and you've gone to awesome resources like Community Governance Aotearoa, a really great tool to keep you on track is a board work plan and a calendar for your ongoing governance work, and making sure that what you're doing is fit for purpose. So if you're really little, don't make a big plan to kind of don't get more policies than you need. Get the ones you need and make sure that you're updating them as you go. Have a work plan and stick to it, and that'll make sure when you get to the next 3 years where you have to go and make the declaration that everything's up to date and running good, you've actually done the work and you're not scrabbling to do it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Action plans or work plans is just a yearly plan to tick off what you're doing. So, you're just kind of checking in all the time alongside you, keeping on target with your strategy or vision. Now, there is a question that's come in and there's been a few responses, which maybe throw over to you, Steven. Accumulated funds, this is from Jill, and this has actually come up in the Act, hasn't it? So that's really interesting. Can you discuss how and what is required for the report of the reasons on holding of accumulated funds? Now, this is really interesting because there's a bit of tension here around holding too much money and not spending it. So what's your thoughts on this, Steven?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm glad that the person or the people have raised it there. And Andrew, you feel free to comment. But basically, this is a change which is coming out in the annual reporting that's required. So this is a draft. I'll just hold it up so you can see. This is kind of what it's going to say. And you're going to have to be saying here, if you hold accumulated funds, this is in the presentation I put in the chat, which maybe we can send out. Charities with more than 140,000 will have to give reasons for why they're holding on to their funds instead of using them to advance the charitable purpose. Now, my view is don't get scared by this, because there probably is a reason that you're holding on to the funds. For example, we have a building project and we are now saving so that we can build a community center or something like that. So I think it's going to be, or we're holding on to them so that we can have ongoing revenue streams from the interest that we earn. I think those would be legitimate reasons why you are sitting on accumulated funds. So it is a change though, and it is a really interesting one at a philosophical level. Is it of interest? Why should we say what's the requirement? Like, it's a new thing. So it's probably a whole other topic we could talk a lot more on, but great question.
It is a great question. Thank you for your answer too, Steven. And Andrew's just put in there, because I'm not sure if you're still bit underwater, Andrew, but so this does apply to large charities, 1 to 3. Again, we've got some templates that you can see we fall in there, but tier 4 charities don't need to report on this. So that's a good one because it's just accountability in use of sometimes public money. Steven, I was just going to say, do you have a talk coming up that we're happy to share out? So we have a Pānui, our newsletter goes out next week, so we're happy to put a shout out there. Andrew, if you've got any workshops that you've got on for charities as well about this, we will pop them in there because you often have those pop-in sessions. And Michelle, any links to volunteers or how that kind of, how we might look after our volunteers in the sector would also be of use. So what we're going to do is we'll collate all of those and we'll share them out post this. But
I'm going to be doing a session as a follow-up in about 2 weeks. So yeah, it's going to be answering questions that people have. So going a bit deeper on some of these points that might be of interest. It'll be a free session. And I want to address one thing. I know there's a perception that lawyers are costly, but a lot of us got into the law to help people. And so we actually genuinely want to support community groups. And one of the things that I often do is have a commute every day home. So I'm happy to have conversations with people if that would help them. I know that sounds really strange for a lawyer to say, but it's actually true. So that's something I wanted to make sure was known.
No, we don't believe it, Stephen. No, we do. Thank you so much for your time and resources too. Carolyn's got a nice Facebook group in there, so we might jump onto that one too for those who want to share in some chats with not-for-profit sector. And Andrew is saying that there's lots of workshops happening as well. So that's also awesome. We've got a couple of minutes left, so just scrolling through if we've left off any other topics. Andrew, are we able to hear from you now? Is it still?
I mean, we can try. I suspect it's still pretty bad.
Wasn't too bad. I heard that.
Well, we'll try, and I can put stuff into the chat if we need to.
Yeah, thank you.
Rose, I had one thing to mention for those on the call, because one thing that you should be thinking about with governance is diversifying your income streams. So as you're looking into that, the word that you'll probably start hearing more of is impact investing. So in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a paper that we just put out about impact investing and how it can be used to be able to diversify your income streams. So I know that's always a hot topic, like how can we make this more sustainable? So I'll just drop that in now. It may interest you.
Yeah, it is it's right across the board too, just not for our not-for-profit sector, but also for businesses, and everyone's having to kind of rethink where we're kind of going with income streams and revenue, and it's huge impact at the moment happening in our community.
The other challenge I have is the phrase not-for-profit. I'd like to encourage you to join my movement of saying, why do we describe not as the first word and for-profit if it's as if that was the thing that we should aim for? Why don't we reframe it from not-for-profit to for-purpose or something that's more positive? So you're welcome to join that. We'll see how we get on.
I think it's one that comes up quite a bit. For me personally, I think it's a sector response, really. So not for me to say. It's really what our community thinks and what they want to call ourselves. But I'm just going to do a little bit of a plug, because later this year we will be having in-person events for community governance. And that will be neat to hear from our community in person. And that's something that we can actually see if what the title is and if it's still kind of working. So that's where I'd love to kind of pose that question out to our sector. We've had such a big response to this. There is lots of different questions coming, and it is around different structures, different types, different entities, so a lot to kind of digest. The team and I will be doing our best to collate a lot of these resources. We'll get the video up, and it comes up on our website, so you can download it, watch it later. You can also, like I said, listen on audio. And we're going to do a little bit of the FAQ handout as well. So lots of those links, presentations, where to go, and we'll keep you up to date. Because of the big response, we might need to do something again later this year, but let us know, email us and let us know your thoughts or what you're struggling with, and we'll help direct you to the right people, such as on the call today. So thanks to everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Friday, post Anzac Day. So ngā mihi ni kia koutou to everyone. Take care. Have a fabulous weekend and see you soon.